To start things off, please join me in welcoming Laura Thompson with the National Climate Change and Wildlife Science Center, who will be introducing our speaker today. Laura?
Thank you, John. I'm very happy to introduce Helen Sofair as a speaker at our center's webinar series. Helen is a quantitative ecologist who studies the impacts of global change, including climate change, land use change, and species invasions. After receiving her PhD in ecology from Colorado State University, she worked with Drs. Barry Noon and Susan Skagen on a North Central Climate Science Center funded project assessing climate change impacts in the Prairie Pothole Region. She is currently a Mendenhall postdoctoral fellow at US Geological Survey's Fort Collins Science Center. So thank you, Helen, for being here.
Thanks so much for having me today, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. As she said, I'm going to talk about work that my collaborators, Barry Noon and Susan Skagen, Valerie Steen, Kurt Flather, and others did projecting climate change impacts on wetland-dependent birds in the Prairie Pothole region. And let me make sure I can advance the slides. So I want to talk about how we can use modeling to inform management in this era of global change. And many management decisions really come down to prioritizing what to do with limited resources. So where on the landscape to invest in conservation or management, and which species to actively monitor or manage for. And the reality of climate change is that these decisions have to be made despite uncertainty about the future. And one theme that cuts across all the work I'm going to present today is really attempting to quantify and address the uncertainties that are inherent to any modeling effort. So I want to start with the spatial prioritization. And in this context, I modeled the distribution of wetlands across the U.S. part of the Prairie Pothole region in the Dakotas and Montana. And the goal was to project the impacts of climate change. So as many of you likely know, these wetlands are the most important breeding habitat for harvested waterfowl in the U.S., and they also provide habitat for many other wetland-dependent species. So this plot shows the average wetland densities along segments of the Fish and Wildlife Service's May Pond Count Survey. And densities are highest in a region called the Missouri Coteau, which is east of the Missouri River. The Prairie Pothole Region boundary is kind of shown with that dotted line that's not the state boundaries. And I used wetland counts from this data set to model the responses of the system to land use and land cover and also to weather. And I did this with the random forest machine learning method and also with Bayesian spatial models. And in general, I'm not really going to get into too much of the modeling details, but I'm happy to answer questions about that for anyone that's interested. So we know that the number of wetlands varies in space, but it also varies in time. So this is a really dynamic system. And in wet years, there can be millions more ponds, which are shown in the dashed line, than in drought years. And duck populations actually track that variation as well, so that's the solid line on this graph. And because the system is so sensitive to weather, that's really why there's so much concern that climate change could affect both the distribution and number of wetlands and, in turn, the avian populations that rely on them. And so the concern in this system is a really general one. Basically, will the lands in the current network of conservation, the current reserve network, continue to provide suitable habitat in the future? And in particular, in this system, research by Carter Johnson and his colleagues suggested that the central portion of the Prairie Pothole region, which is where the highest wetland densities are now, could become too dry to host productive wetlands in the future. So that work considered the potential effects of changes in temperature and precipitation on vegetative cycles in wetlands that basically underlie wetland productivity. And so in their models, the highly favorable conditions are shown in red, and with only changes in temperature and not compensatory increases in precipitation, they projected that the most productive habitats would move to the east. But one of the assumptions in this work was that wetland basins are evenly distributed, and also that climate change will occur in a uniform way across the landscape. And so those were things we wanted to consider in our analysis, both climate change and also realistic patterns of land use and land use change. Oh, this one came out terribly. Okay, well, because water balance is so key to the dynamics of the system, basically a major part of our work was understanding what the different climate models had to say about the projected future water balance. And I think we can't really see much here, but basically what this was trying to show was precipitation minus potential evapotranspiration, and the red is drier conditions, and blue would be wetter conditions. And so obviously this is very fuzzy, but the takeaway point is each one of these plots refers to a different model, and the names are jumbled, at least in the version I can see. But some of the models projected overall drying, and some projected overall wetting. So the models actually agree that it's going to get warmer, but some project enough increased rainfall to compensate for that. And this climate variable was the most important predictor in our models. So you can imagine that what we found was that the drier models predicted fewer wetlands, and the wetter models predicted more. Let's see. Oh, man, this one's blurry, too. The citation at the bottom is where these figures are from. But what we found was that wetland densities were projected to decline overall, but not to shift in space. So I'll walk you through what you would be seeing here. And what I want to emphasize is that climate mattered and land use mattered too. So the top row here shows projections to the historical simulation of the climate models. It's the average across 10 climate models. And in the middle row are projections to future simulations. And in the bottom row is a comparison between those. So that bottom one gets at the impact of climate change. And you can see the red kind of diagonal line cutting across the bottom outermost two figures. And those are under the columns here are different land use scenarios. So the left one is the current pattern, basically assuming the future mirrors the present. And the one that's pretty similar to that on the far right is stems from a collaboration with Ben Rashford, who's an agricultural economist and who developed projections of land use change under these same climate models. And basically the same patterns. Those two outer scenarios are kind of the most realistic, and they both show that red line basically right where wetland densities are the highest now, and that red corresponds to lower wetland densities. So that's where we get the understanding that they're projected to decline. Whereas the upper two rows, and again, I really apologize for this, I don't know if you can sort of make out that the most blue is in that same place. So the most wetlands are still kind of in the same place. The middle column corresponds to a scenario with uniform land use and a uniform distribution of wetland basins, and so that's actually most similar to kind of the assumptions underlying Carter-Johnson's work. And I think I'll say also that I view this work as kind of complementary to that managers will want to know about both wetland numbers, which is what our work informed, and also wetland condition, which is what that work primarily informed. So let's see if we can move on and hopefully get to some figures that are useful. Woohoo! Sort of. All right. So one of the approaches that I just want to kind of mention really briefly is that what we did is we captured the whole distribution of projected changes within climate models. And so that's why we had sort of separate predictions to each model's historical simulation and each model's future simulation. And basically, we call that the model space method. And this is, I really had the great fortune in doing this work through the Climate Science Center to kind of link up with the climate scientists themselves, and in particular with Joe Barsugli, who really taught me a ton about assessing climate change impacts. And basically, the model space method, we call it that because it asks what happens to the ecological impact kind of in the world of the climate model. And in contrast, most ecological climate change studies are based on the delta method, so they assume that extremes are going to change at the same rate as the mean. And this is kind of baked into data sets like WorldClim and Climate NA. And the model space method allowed us to take more information from the climate model about how different parts of the distribution were projected to change. And basically, this is important because extremes can often be projected to change faster than climate means. And so this figure shows the projected change in the hottest July day that would be expected in a 10-year period, just for one climate model. So don't read into the precise spatial patterns here. But basically, for this model, that the delta method effectively assumes that this measure of a climate extreme is going to change at the same rate as the mean of July maximum temperature. But the climate model actually projects a much faster rate of change in the extreme as in a lot of the Midwest. As you can see, it's like the difference of 5 degrees C or something like that. So it's a pretty big deal. And we basically, I learned so much from Joe that I wrote a paper about it. So it's really about how can we kind of do these climate change impact assessments in a way that that kind of matches the drivers of our study systems. And when we know that extremes often are important to ecological systems, how can we design climate change impact assessments to kind of take more from the climate models in terms of what they project about changes in extreme events. Okay, so now I want to shift gears to talk about prioritization among species. And I'm going to break this into 3 different questions and kind of spend just a brief overview on each one. So the first is, are waterfowl good surrogates for other wetland-dependent birds? Next, I'll talk about which wetland-dependent birds are most vulnerable to climate change. And lastly, I'll talk about more recent work that asks how reliable are our methods for projecting range change. And again, a theme that cuts across all 3 of these questions is how do we deal with uncertainty, and especially the uncertainty that arises from the modeling methods themselves. All right, so in this system, there are 5 species of upland nesting ducks that are the focus of really a lot of current management. And we wanted to quantify how well these ducks serve as surrogates for other species. And so what we're seeing here are the 5 species, and then on the map is what's often referred to as the thunderstorm map, and basically it's a map of the density of waterfowl breeding pairs. And again, you can see that red in the Missouri-Coteau, which is this region that's been the focus of a lot of investment. And I've overlaid breeding bird survey routes in black, which were used for kind of to get abundance data for other wetland-dependent birds. So it makes sense that waterfowl could act as surrogates for other species because just as I showed earlier, duck populations track pond counts, so do the populations of some other wetland-dependent birds of interest. And so in addition to that, the waterfowl can act potentially as kind of umbrella species, which is a type of surrogate species, because they use a variety of wetland habitats. For example, they generally breed at highest densities in uplands surrounding smaller wetlands. And then when they're raising their broods, they move to larger, deeper wetlands that still have water later in the breeding season. So because these species kind of share this critical resource, and a lot of the investments have basically been aimed at not essentially getting easements to prevent draining of wetlands, that's something that benefits these other species, and there has been work testing that and showing that. So a common method for selecting surrogates is to first cluster, take the species you're interested in this case wetland-dependent birds, cluster them into groups, and then select a representative from each group as a surrogate. And the goal here is that that can make the surrogate set be comprehensive in that all the species in the species pool are kind of covered by one of the surrogates, i.e. grouped with it, and also complementary in that each surrogate species represents different species in the species pool. But in practice, clustering is really sensitive to the methods that are used. So as part of this work, we generated species clusters based on trait data and abundance data, and we used different sets of traits, and we used abundance data at different scales. So for example, at each breeding bird survey stop versus summarized at a coarser scale. And those are essentially the input data that go into a metric of dissimilarity and in turn into a hierarchical clustering method. And depending on the decisions that are used in the clustering, you can get a really different set of relationships among species. So here we get essentially a tree depicting these relationships, and each letter at the tips of the tree represents a hypothetical species. And so in addition, the red lines kind of represent the decision of where do we cut the tree, which essentially corresponds to how many groups do we want to create. And each of these choices leads to a binary in versus out view of which species are grouped together. So which species will be a surrogate for another. And these resulting groups really can vary a lot, qualitatively vary a lot. And I'm not going to get into all these different groups, but what we did in this work is we developed an ensemble across all these different methodological choices. And one of the advantages of that is that it gave us a continuous perspective on the strength of surrogate relationships. And at the same time, it encompasses all that uncertainty that arises from the input data and the clustering method. So we are visualizing here this ensemble in a network, and each species is a circle. And I apologize for using the bird codes, which only the birders will understand, but the 5 focal waterfowl are shown in gray, so they cluster together, and that's kind of how we can interpret these network plots, is that the closer the circles are to each other, the more similar the species were. In this case, only abundance data went into this particular network, so this shows similarity in patterns of relative abundance. And this pattern that the 5 focal ducks clustered together was really consistent across all of our both input trees, and also showed up prominently in the ensembles. And so we see then this gradient in the strength of the surrogate relationships. And the ducks have the weakest relationships with some songbirds, which are, there's some examples like the sedge-wren and the willow flycatcher up in the upper left. And the strongest relationship here with the sora and also with other waterfowl. And one of the advantages of making this kind of continuous is that instead of having this kind of binary view, it actually lets a manager kind of decide what level of surrogacy is good enough given the context and their resources. So next I want to talk about work that was led by Valerie Steen, who did her PhD with Barry Noon and Susan Scoggin and is now a postdoc with Morgan Tingley. And she did a really nice study where she fit species distribution models to project range change in wetland-dependent birds in this region. And she really rigorously varied different modeling inputs and modeling decisions and looked at the implications for range change. And again here, there's a ton of uncertainty that just comes from the modeling methods as well as from the underlying climate model. So this is an example for the mallard where for one set of decisions shown in the top row, each sort of decision set is shown in a row. Basically, for different sets of decisions, you get kind of similar current mapped predictions about the current distribution. So the left-hand top and bottom look pretty similar. But then these different decision sets, which include basically the climate model, the set of covariates, how they were thresholded, other modeling decisions, give really different projections about how much range loss is expected. And this is a really common feature, I think, of using species distribution models to project the impacts of climate change, that often models that give pretty similar predictions in the current time period can be pretty divergent in terms of what they project for the future. And Valerie did this across a set of wetland-dependent birds. And so for each species, which again are these bird codes, there's this box plot that shows the variability in these different both input data sets and climate projections and modeling decisions. And the what they're showing variability in is the range change index, which is basically an index of how range size is going to change in the future, where 0 is no change and negative values are lost and positive values are gain. And we see there's a lot of variation within a species. The species here are ordered from the SORA, which was projected to be the most vulnerable, i.e. to have the greatest loss on average, up to or down to the great blue heron, which most of the decision sets led actually to projections of gain. And one of the things that we really wondered about is, how stable is kind of this ranking of vulnerability? Like how much can we kind of rely on that ranking? For example, I showed you that some of the climate models project a wetter future and some of the climate models project a drier future, and it could be that kind of the dry models are essentially contributing to these decision sets that in which more loss is projected, and then the wetter models are, on the kind of right-hand side where they're associated with less loss or with gain. And so if essentially varying these decisions gives a similar order of vulnerability, then we can be a lot more confident in that order. And so what we looked at is the vulnerability ranks across these decision sets. And what Val found was that the SORA was consistently projected to be the most vulnerable, and the great blue heron was consistently projected to be the least vulnerable. But the relative position of the other species really depended on the method. And so the reason I think this is so important is it kind of tells us, at what level can we feel more confident in our in the information that we're providing to decision makers. And I think this really highlights kind of really the coarseness of that level. So here we can say that the SORA really rose to the top of this vulnerability assessment. But for most species, there's so much modeling uncertainty that it's hard to rank them according to their vulnerability. And you might recall that the SORA was one of the species that was expected to benefit most from management of waterfowl because it clustered pretty closely to those 5 focal ducks. So that's both good news and also something to validate in future work. So the last The last piece of research I want to touch on is a more recent validation study asking how reliable range change projections are. And ideally, we'd want to see a nice positive relationship between projected and observed change in range size. And in a way, for these kinds of things, we care probably more about these ranks, like can we be focusing on the right species and maybe less about the absolute numbers. And I think these models are useful if they give us the right ranks. So this is work I did in collaboration with Kurt Flather and Catherine Jarnovich. And what we did is we estimated species distribution models based on breeding bird survey data from the late 70s. And then we developed predictions to recent years. So what I'm showing is a map of the breeding bird survey routes that went into this analysis. And actually both what are labeled here as estimation and validation routes, both of those were used in estimation, and the validation is in time, not in space. So these validation routes are routes that were surveyed in all 6 years that we used the data for. And so we knew how occupancy changed at those routes. And we did this analysis basically in a way that if a species was present in one of the 3 years in each time period, then we counted that as present, and we only counted absences when the species was absent in all 3 years and when the route was surveyed in all 3 years. So these validation routes were surveyed in all 6 years, and there's 512 of those across the country. So what we did is for 190 songbird species, we estimated an ensemble of species distribution models based on bioclim variables and pretty coarse metrics of land use. So I want to highlight the contrast between this work and Val's work, where her study really targeted the covariates towards things that were important for wetland-dependent birds, things that we knew were, for example, hydrological variables that we knew were important in the wetland model and things like that, whereas here the covariates are totally generic across species. They're always the same. We had different sets, but they're always the same. And they're not related to species ecology. So this is really kind of a test of a more automated type of species distribution modeling. And again, we estimated models from using data from the late 70s and then predicted to this recent time period. And what we found was that our models looked great in this recent time period. So in terms of the model validation, it suggested that there's good transferability in time, which is a challenge for species distribution models. And actually, most kind of validation studies often stop here. So what I'm showing is a histogram where the height of the bars represent the number of species, and AUC is the area under the receiver operator curve. It's one of the most common performance metrics in species distribution modeling, and it's a metric of discrimination performance. So how well does the model separate between the zeros and ones? And so if we see here, most species have an AUC above 0.9, which is considered generally excellent. So this shows that overall the models are doing really well on this validation data from the current years. But what we found was that the change in range size was really not reliable at all. So there was effectively no relationship between observed and predicted range change, and the vulnerability ranks, you know, it's like, I think I'm better at darts than, you know, this right-hand plot shows. So it's pretty bad. So what we're looking at here is, on the left, we're looking at this plot of range change where, just like in Val's work, 0 was no change in range size. Here, range size is represented by the number of occupied routes. So it's not gridded cells across the landscape. It's just at the breeding bird survey routes. And each point on this figure represents a species. So the dots are bigger for the more common species, and they're smaller for the rarer species. And the species that tripled its range size was actually the house finch, so this point kind of on the far right, and the models didn't really predict that. So on the right, in this right-hand side plot, what we're seeing is a ranked version of this, where we're looking at where 1 is the most vulnerable and 190 is the least vulnerable, and we're again looking at what was observed in terms of loss of and gain of in the number of routes that were occupied over this about 35-year period versus the prediction. And so I think this was really kind of a head-scratcher for us at first because you know, I just showed you in the last figure that we had this great overall performance, and yet here I'm showing there's basically a total inability to predict which species will be most vulnerable. And I should mention this includes land use change, at least coarsely, and so we expect that might have been the greatest driver of distributional changes in the past few decades. And of course, we know more about how land use has changed in the past 30 years than we know about when we try to get, when we try to start looking forward. There's a lot more uncertainty. But basically, to explain kind of this mismatch between good overall performance and yet terrible ranking of vulnerability, what we found was that there was actually poor prediction where change occurred. So this kind of collapses across all species, across all the validation routes. And what we see is that there's 4 potential categories we're referring to here as the root status. So a species could have gained, could have not been there historically and been there now, could have lost occupancy on the route, could have always been there or never been there. And you can see that most places are always or never occupied. So there's a relatively small number of routes that change status. And if you look within the always vertical bar here, it's mostly green, which corresponds to an always predicted status. So basically, the models are getting that right. And similarly, if you look within this biggest bar, the never bar, it's mostly blue. And that corresponds to this never predicted status. And so the models are getting that right, too. So the models are doing really well for places where the species is always or never there. But when we look at the places where range expansion or contraction was observed, the models actually do really badly at that. They usually, again, predict that the species was always or never there. And so this is kind of a bummer because this, you know, the gain and loss is what we care about the most. You know, we want to know where are the locations that are vulnerable to range loss. We want to know, you know, where are the locations that are becoming potentially suitable in the future. And that, precisely what we want to know is what the models do badly. And so it raises challenges for our ability to both understand relative vulnerability and also to link kind of that vulnerability back to spatial planning, to kind of say, okay, where on the landscape are we going to change our management strategy to, you know, benefit a species that we expect to be vulnerable. So actually want to kind of stop there to leave plenty of time for questions and really challenge, I guess, both the research and the management communities to think about, you know, how do we support these prioritization decisions under climate change, land use change? You know, what kinds of information and at what kind of resolution and level of confidence can we as researchers provide? And given our limitations, you know, from a manager's perspective, what would be useful kind of despite the uncertainty? And I think the fact remains that we still, or somebody still has to make hard decisions about where to invest resources and with what goal. And what my work tries to get at is, you know, to understand the uncertainty kind of behind the science that can support those decisions and then kind of hopefully move towards supporting the decisions despite the uncertainty, or acknowledging in some cases that we might not be able to say much with confidence. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge funding from the North Central Climate Science Center and also from the USGS Mendenhall Postdoc Fellowship, and thank the many collaborators without whom this work would not have been possible.
I would like to thank Helen and USGS once again for continuing this webinar series. Love having you guys as a partner, and I'd like to thank everyone who was able to view the webinar.
I sort of showed a few different examples about thinking about what can we say with confidence, and I think it would be interesting to hear people chime in. I guess I'll answer. I saw one question pop up here.
Yeah.
The question is, do you think it's possible
to use your? Oh, sorry. Do you think it's possible to use your early results to map climate change refugia for the prairie potholes? Sorry.
I think it sort of. So I'd say at what scale? I'd say the inputs to the pond models are already at a relatively coarse spatial scale, so they correspond to segments, like the number of wetlands over a segment that was flown. At the same time, so I think they're useful, but not kind of at this, like, this kilometer here versus that kilometer there. And I think probably that's, probably we try to map refugia at using GCM projections at a finer level than so there's sort of real information within a GCM, and in a way it can be almost more useful to like look at what's on the landscape now, like where is there an inversion now, and what can that tell us about where refugia might be, things like that. I think in the prairie potholes what that corresponds to is, firstly, where are there areas where there are wetlands that essentially, what it's often referred to as wetland complexes that encompass a variety of depths. And so the shallower wetlands are actually can provide really important habitats, especially for species like pintail, which are of concern because they've been declining. But of course, deeper wetlands are more likely to have water there under drier conditions. And so by kind of looking at wetland complexes and kind of bet hedging in depth, in terms of water depth as much as in space, I think that's probably a really useful method that actually aligns pretty closely with the current management strategy. And then I'd say there's also the other thing that popped out of this work was the Prairie Coteau was a region where I'd say that was where there was both good alignment of current habitats with less negative projections for the future. So I think that could be another area sort of generally, and then kind of within that general area, managers would of course have to go and make decisions about what land and wetlands are in good condition. So let's see. Okay. John Gross asks if some of the results aren't pessimistic, since I assume all models are equal and surely some are better than others. Yeah, I mean, I want to believe these results are pessimistic. That paper actually just came out this past week online, and if you look, there's this like really long supplement where we tried all these different things, and basically we're like trying to save it, like I want to be able to do this, but so we tried things like using the optimal calibration for each time period, which of course you would never know how kind of the optimal threshold for moving from continuous to binary predictions would change in the future, right? You never know that, but for this validation study we did know that, and we tried things like that, which helped a little bit, help for common species. In terms of this assumption that all the models are equal, so actually the model for each species is actually an ensemble across several methods. And each method was weighted by its AUC. So, there's some attempt kind of built into this ensemble to encompass variation model quality, like models that had an AUC lower than 0.7 didn't contribute to the ensemble. But, I think it's like thinking about the work that Val showed, where some models can have really similar predictions to the current time period and yet really divergent predictions to the future. It can be hard to tell which model's better, right? If they're all kind of correlative models, and there's not, it's ideal if we can have more of a mechanistic sense of the drivers and build really careful models for a specific species of interest. But for this kind of type of correlative modeling, sometimes it can be hard to use validation in withheld data to kind of separate among these models that then lead to pretty different outcomes. And actually that's true of the clustering as well, where we validated our clusters and we get a similar, like R squared, like a similar variance explained from different clusters, but yet those clusters look really different in terms of which species are grouped together. And so that's, again, I think one of the advantages of ensembling is that when we're not sure which method is better a priori, and we can't make that decision up front, we can kind of encompass these outputs from multiple models. Let's see. Could I see this methodology being applied to other regions of patchy ephemeral wetlands like the Playa Lakes? I'd say absolutely, and I think in the last few years, honestly, there are opportunities to do like really cool modeling using there's now like remotely sensed information about, I think it's like on a monthly level. I think Google Earth Engine has essentially like water, surface water product. And so there's the potential to use things like that to say not just where are the wetlands in May, which is all we did, but how long are these wetlands holding water on the landscape? And I think in the Playa Lakes area, they're often smaller wetlands, and we know that there's some kind of minimum time that these wetlands have to have water to really like line up with the phenology of breeding. And so, there's this opportunity, I think, to kind of scale this up pretty broadly and make some of those connections.
Thank you again, Helen. We'll see if anyone types while I'm saying my goodbyes. I would like to once again thank everyone who participated. Thank you everyone who threw out questions out there, and thank you Helen and USGS for continuing and moving this webinar series forward.
Yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in.
Have a good one.
All right.